Forward Guidance is brought to you by VanEck, a global leader in asset management since 1955. You'll be hearing more about a VanEck ETF later on, but for now, let's get into today's interview. Very pleased to welcome back to Forward Guidance Jay Shabat, an analyst with Skift Airline Weekly and publisher of the Railroad Weekly Substack. As the introductions might suggest, Jay is an expert in all things trains and planes, and that is what we're going to be discussing today. Jay, great to see you. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm good, Jack. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Great to see you again, Jay. Let's start with trains, because trains are often seen, railroads, as a indicator of the lifeblood of the American manufacturing economy. So broadly speaking, in terms of volumes, in terms of pricing, what are you seeing in the American railroad sphere? And when I say railroads, we are not talking about consumer railroads. Mostly it is freight. So containers, mainly referenced by professionals such as yourself as intermodal, and then also things like coal, chemicals, and the like. What are you seeing in terms of demand, in terms of volumes, and what might that suggest about the health of the American manufacturing economy?
Yeah, good question, Jack. So I'll start by saying that, yes, we are just focusing here on the freight railroads within North America. And we could, you asked about the U.S., we'll talk about the U.S. I do cover Canada and Mexico as well, so all of North America. Really, you can think of it, there are 6 big railroads in North America. There's 2 in the Western U.S., 2 in the Eastern U.S., 2 in Canada. So those are your 6. And then there's another big one in Mexico. One of the Canadian railroads owns a big railroad in Mexico. So that's just the structure of the industry. It's a little bit of background before I answer your question. So yeah, just to get right into it, the demand for freight railroads, it's unfortunately been, I guess the best word is mixed. In one sense, it's, freight demand is growing. So in volume terms, freight demand for the first half of 2024 is up about 2% across. That's across the U.S. Maybe a little bit. Roughly the same across if you include Canada and Mexico as well. Let's call it 2%. However, that 2% is off a rather easy comparison, because in 2023, railroad freight was rather depressed for a variety of reasons. And we're still not even back to where we were in 2018, which was, we can call that sort of the high point, the recent high point. What does that say about the economy of the U.S.? Well, I hesitate to extrapolate too much about, the U.S. economy from what's going on the railroad side. I think there was a time in American history where rail freight would reflect broader economic trends. I think that's less true today because the manufacturing component of the economy is just less a percentage of the whole. We think about healthcare being so large, and education and other services, even travel and tourism. Railroads largely don't touch those sectors. So be careful about me drawing any conclusions between rail freight and what the overall U.S. economy is doing. However, it does somewhat mirror what's going on in the manufacturing sector. And I think as you can see from any of your reports that published by the Federal Reserve or the ISM surveys, manufacturing has been rather weak over the coming out of the pandemic. I think that's railroads have felt that. So again, just to say, the U.S. economy grew at a very healthy clip last year, but the manufacturing sector of the economy less so. That certainly wasn't the driver of the growth.
So maybe there was a time when the American economy was very dependent on manufacturing, where the manufacturing economy and the rail freight economy was very representative of the overall economy. And Alan Greenspan paid a lot of attention to rail car freight loadings as a leading indicator. Now that's not the case. 80% of the economy is services, not manufacturing, not goods. So that's interesting. So volumes are down. Why are volumes down from 2018? The economy's grown so much since then.
And I just want to add one I think important point here. I don't want to mislead anyone to think that railroads are only exposed to the manufacturing economy. They are to a large extent. They do have a lot of business on the consumer side as well. You mentioned those intermodal containers. Everything you walk into a Walmart, whatever's on the shelf probably arrived there, somewhere along the journey from, China to the port of Los Angeles to Chicago, somewhere along the journey involved a railroad trip. So, there is some definitely consumer oriented exposure there. Now, the question, why are we down? Well, a very big reason is coal. So coal is, coal largely, if you go back, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, coal was just absolutely critical to the development of the railroads. Now, coal no longer powers the locomotives like it once did. We know, they now use diesel fuel. But as customers, utilities, so power companies, they still very much use coal to produce electricity. We also use coal to make steel. So the only way to really move coal is by rail. So those are very important customers. However, as you know, because for environmental reasons, the U.S. economy has moved away from coal. So we're just we're using a lot less coal than we used to, and so that has affected. When you ask me why are rail volumes lower today than they were 6 years ago, the biggest reason is coal's decline. Now there are other areas too. I mean, right now the railroads are experiencing they do have exposure to the housing market. And although we've seen some activity pick up a little bit in housing construction, that's been very weak. And, as you've discussed on your show, many times, that has to do with, higher interest rates and whatnot, the people just not taking mortgages anymore. That is another reason why rail traffic has been a little softer than, maybe hoped for. And then, as we said before, just manufacturing output, whether it be autos or whatever it is that railroads carry, has just been soft in the last couple of years. Hasn't been a lot of growth.
So there hasn't been a lot of growth in the volumes. What has the impact been on the rail companies' revenues and profits? Because it is a very concentrated industry, right?
Yeah, so it's a very concentrated industry, and that's an important question you ask. So when I say that rail volumes are only up 2% so far this year, and they were down last year, they're down from 7 years ago. Do not be misled. Railroads, the big six that I mentioned, still extraordinarily profitable. Some of the highest margin companies you'll find throughout the U.S. economy. I mean, routinely 35, 40% operating margins, which is, Microsoft and Meta and, Silicon Valley type margins. So very profitable. And that has to do with, certainly wasn't always that way in U.S. history, but starting at in 1980 was kind of a seminal year because that's when Congress passed, basically restructured the industry through legislation. Over the ensuing decade and a half, 2 decades, you had a lot of consolidation. So now we're left with these, 6 big railroads in North America, 4 in the U.S., and you have a bunch of smaller, a couple hundred smaller railroads that cooperate with the big guys as well. But because of that consolidation, because of the structural nature of the industry, pricing power tends to be very, very strong. Now, it's going to be stronger for certain commodities than others. So, for example, chemicals is a very big business for railroads. That tends to be, railroads have a lot of pricing power there because it's hard to move a lot of that on trucks or, any kind of alternative forms of transportation. Same thing with coal, as we mentioned. Whereas maybe the where they have the least pricing power would be the intermodal, the boxes. So this is the container boxes that are all standardized size. They'll get shipped over from Asia. They'll enter a port on the West Coast. This is just a very typical pattern. The rail will bring it to Chicago, and from there they'll move on to distribution centers. There's also some of the boxes move just domestically as well. So that business is very price competitive. But again, I think the important point to remember here is that railroads are extraordinarily profitable, which is very different from what we'll be talking about soon in the airlines. But we'll get there.
Yes, and the airlines much less profitable. Railroads, because they're concentrated, are very profitable. But it's my understanding they didn't always used to be that way. When the railroads were first started, very capital intensive, and there was tons of competition, so very common for railroads to go bankrupt. Can you just take us a quick tour through the 6 North American rail lines? Who owns them? Which are the 2 ones in Canada, and which are the biggest and the strongest?
Yeah, sure. So we'll start in the West because they tend to be the U.S. West because they tend to be the biggest. Well, they are the biggest. So the two biggest ones are BNSF, and again, these are all the ones I'm going to mention are products of multiple mergers over the past couple decades. So BNSF is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, which is Warren Buffett's company, of course. So they are privately held. They do report they disclose their financial results each quarter, so we can give a good sense of how they're doing. They don't do earnings calls like the other guys, and so it's a little bit less transparent because Berkshire Hathaway they have their own way of doing things. But so that's the probably the biggest. Then there's Union Pacific, which competes with them in the West. That's a publicly traded company. They happen to, I believe, last year and maybe even last quarter, if I recall, they actually had the best profit margins of any of the big six. And we can get into that, but that partially all these companies that I'm going to mention, they're all extraordinarily profitable, and the difference is not that big between margins. But usually the differential comes down to sort of the mix of what they carry. So Union Pacific tends to carry less of these price sensitive boxes as a percentage of their revenue. So that kind of helps them. Moving on, so over on the East Coast, we have CSX and Norfolk Southern, also two publicly traded companies. Now, Norfolk Southern was in the news a lot during the first half of this year because of an investor that basically wanted to get rid of management.
An activist investor.
Correct. So they had activist investor. They staged a proxy fight. They nominated their own board directors. They even proposed their own, new CEO, new chief operating officer. They, very bitter fight. The existing management defended, defend constantly, on CNBC and, all media just defending themselves. Ultimately, management, they retain their jobs. So the activist investors called Ancora, they're based in Ohio, they wound up losing the battle. They did, however, win 3 board seats, and management did have to, I don't know what the right word is, accommodate them to a certain extent. Maybe, made some changes. They might not made some new hires that they might not otherwise would have, if not for the proxy fight. So I wouldn't say Ancora totally lost, but management did keep their jobs. So moving on, there's we said Norfolk, they're based in Atlanta. CSX, based in Jacksonville, Florida. And then the 2 Canadian ones are interesting. Canadian National, based in Montreal. And then you have Canadian Pacific, which is based in Calgary, in the western half. Now they last year completed a takeover of Kansas City Southern. So they're now called CPKC, Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern. So they are now one company. And what's interesting about Kansas City Southern is that they have control over one of Mexico's largest railroads. And that Mexico is a very hot market right now because of all the nearshoring, the investment in very, very large many auto plants down there that's helped supply, and a lot of parts going back and forth, work with Detroit's big 3 and the Asian manufacturers. So that's a very active market. Mexican rail market is actually, growing quite healthily, still, much smaller than, the US market, of course, but it is, you'll hear people talk with a lot of enthusiasm about Mexico. The railroad's very enthusiastic about it.
Is that enthusiasm matched by the results that you're seeing? What kind of growth are you seeing in volumes and in pricing in Mexico? Because that is a hotbed of industrial manufacturing activity, especially with nearshoring, as you said.
Yeah, so you do see, if you look at Mexican rail traffic, it is up. It's not double digits, but it is up year over year. There is growth there. The important thing, though, is it's still early. So I think a lot of these nearshoring initiatives, a lot of them are sort of just getting started. So there's hope that there'll just be more and more of this in the coming years. There are some questions. I mean, there are some skeptics about whether or not just how big the Mexican market can grow for the railroads. A lot of it comes down to just some macroeconomic issues. Can Mexico even provide enough electricity to support all of these new factories? Just labor laws can be a little bit iffy. Over on the airline side, I know we'll get there. The the outgoing Mexican government a couple of years ago, they canceled a very large airport project for Mexico City, and it's an airport that's Mexico City badly needs a new airport, and they just overnight they canceled it. I mean, it was already under construction. So I just use that as an example where there could be some political decisions that perhaps cause Mexico to not be able to realize this potential. We don't know, but there's definitely a lot of activity and a lot of enthusiasm.
Thank you. And then let's talk about the container market, the intermodal market, which has a lot of things. If you buy a Walmart or Target, as you said, it comes from a freight container, which is either a freight container, it comes over on a ship and then it either goes on a truck or a rail car. So unlike other stuff where railroads really do have a monopoly and they compete with other railroads, this in the freight market, it can be taken by a truck or a rail car. So you do have that more competition, less pricing power. And I would think that that is indicative of the health of the economy, just because if people are buying a lot of stuff, then there's going to be a lot of freight containers. What are you seeing there in the pricing power? How are rail cars in the intermodal market competing against trucking? And then what's the health of the trucking economy, which I don't know how closely you follow it, but it's very adjacent to the rails.
So let's start by just talking about intermodal market, which is now about half of all the volume that the class one, when I say class one railroads, I'm talking about the big six. It's about half the volume that they now carry. Now, it's not half the revenue because I said the pricing power is a little bit less, but it's still very, very substantial part of the business. Now, you can divide that into international intermodal. That's the stuff that comes over from, it's very typical. It's coming over from China. You produce some toys at a Chinese factory. It comes into the port of Los Angeles or Long Beach or, Seattle, wherever, and gets put onto a railroad, a train, and goes to Chicago, and then that's a very typical pattern. That business, the international business, is actually that's been picking up this year, particularly in volume terms. It's been picking up rather briskly, and that reflects, I think, a couple things. One, it reflects ongoing strength in consumer spending. We've seen, the retail sales reports and things like that. It also, I think, reflects some. You have to always be careful with import numbers. So there are disruptions with shipping in the Red Sea, the Panama Canal, and that tends to, that sometimes shipments that might have gone to, a port over in this part of the world now goes to this part of the world. So there are things like that I'm not an expert in, but there's a little bit, you have to always think about that when you're looking at the numbers. So there's that. Now on the domestic side, that's, strictly, I've got a factory, I've got to move some stuff in a container from, here to there. And I have an option. I can do it by truck or I could do it by rail. Now that business for the railroads is hurting right now. And the reason why is because there's just too much truck capacity. So around Thanksgiving, a little after Thanksgiving 2022, the trucking market just suddenly found itself with way too much capacity. And again, like I said, I don't follow the trucking market nearly as closely, but to the extent that it affects railroads, it's affecting them a lot now because it's very hard to, railroads, they'll sell themselves, they'll advertise the fact that, hey, we are, very cost efficient. We're very environmentally friendly compared to trucks. We don't put as much stress on the national infrastructure, the highways. There's a lot of reasons why, a lot of selling points that railroads can, present to their customers, but it's just very hard on pricing right now because of the overcapacity in trucks. So that's, everybody's kind of waiting for that market to revive. And hopefully from the railroad's perspective, that will be, that domestic intermodal will be an important growth generator, going forward. And by the way, and not to go, I don't want to go too off on a tangent here, but this Ancora investment, the activist investor at Norfolk Southern that we were just talking about, a lot of that dispute had at least partly had something to do with Norfolk Southern being heavily exposed to this price sensitive intermodal market and wanting to go after more of it. And I think Ancora was like, no, we can get the margins higher if we kind of do less of that. Now, the trade-off is that you don't get the growth and, that was a big dispute there.
Forward guidance is brought to you by VanEck. The VanEck Morningstar Wide Moat ETF, ticker MOAT, has outperformed the S&P 500 for over a decade. How? Moat strives to achieve a simple but challenging task. Buy quality stocks when they're undervalued and sell them when they're overvalued. Visit vaneck.com/moatfg to learn more. That's vaneck.com/moatfg. Now the disclosures. All investing is subject to risk, including the possible loss of money you invest. Visit vaneck.com to carefully read a prospectus before investing. The VanEck Morningstar Wide Moat ETF is distributed by VanEck Securities Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of VanEck Associates Corporation. Thanks, let's get back to the interview. So the freight market, both intermodal trains and trucking, so we're talking about containers. The container market, let's say, that has been weak since the fall of 2022, as you said. But is the level of weakness staying the same? Is it marginally improving, or is it getting worse? Because when economists measure recessions, often the recession ends when the economy's still really, really bad, but it just stops getting worse. So the way stock markets and a lot of the way things are priced in is it's all about that rate of change, that second derivative. Is it bad but improving, or bad staying the same, or bad or getting worse?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think every earnings call that the railroads do, and also their railroads have close partners that they conduct this intermodal transport with. So a good example is BNSF, Berkshire Hathaway's company. They work very closely with J.B. Hunt, which is the largest intermodal trucking company. So they're like, later we can talk about how Delta and American Express are like brother and sister, very, very closely aligned. Similar situation, BNSF and JB Hunt work closely together. And if you listen to either one of those companies, the last couple of quarters, they all say, well, we're seeing a few green shoots here. We think maybe it's getting a little better, but it just doesn't. It just hasn't. So there's really no there's really no nothing that I've seen to this point that says we're kind of out of the water now. Now, if you listen to some trucking analysts, they'll say, okay, we're getting to that point where there's going to be some, this overcapacity situation has to resolve itself. There's going to be, more companies going out of business. There's going to be pricing increases, but nothing yet. Now we're on the eve of second quarter earnings season here. So maybe in a couple of, over the next couple of weeks, we'll have a better idea if perhaps, finally this trucking quote unquote recession is over. Now, I guess it's important to say that if you look at the trucking volumes, yes, they're down, but historically speaking, it's not at a very, don't think of them as a depressed level. There's still a lot of goods being moved around, as you might surmise based on the fact that consumer spending is very strong. So, or has, been held up anyway. But yeah, to directly answer your question, maybe some minor green shoots, but no definitive turn yet.
Very interesting. You said some of the rail companies will be reporting their earnings later on in July, but I believe it is Delta Airlines that's going to be starting us off tomorrow. We're recording this Wednesday, July 10th. They'll be reporting tomorrow on July 11th when this interview will air. Let's move on to planes. We've talked a lot about trains. In the plane market, we're talking about, there is some cargo, but it is, unlike what trains, we're talking about transporting people. And so in America, it's United, Delta, American, Southwest. What is the health of the American aviation market, and what does that represent about the American economy?
Yeah, sure. And it's kind of, I said before that if you look at just the railroads nowadays, it won't give you a great picture of the overall economy because it's, we're so much the service sector is so large these days. But if you combine railroads and airlines, I think you get, you get closer to your answers. So that is a benefit. I'll say this. So whereas railroads are struggling to grow, they're struggling, not to make money, but they're struggling to grow. Airlines are seeing very, very, very healthy demand, and that continues. That was true when we last spoke about a year ago. It was true coming out of the pandemic. It's still true today. Now, it's especially true for the, I would say, more premium end of the market. So people traveling in, business class or first class. It's also particularly true for international and even more specific overseas travel. So for the airlines that are exposed to, let's say they fly to Europe, they fly to Asia, they fly to, deep into Latin America, That's the stuff that's really, really doing well now. And that's true all over the world. So if you're Singapore Airlines and you're flying all over the world, if you're, Japan Airlines, whatever, this long haul intercontinental travel, particularly on the premium side, is doing very well. So now at the same time, we have on the supply side, we have a supply shortage, an aircraft shortage. And that has to do with a very serious supply chain issues for both Boeing and Airbus. I think everybody watching will be familiar with some of Boeing's problems on the safety side, the management side. It's broader than just that. Yeah, it's maybe euphemistic to say that, but problems on the safety side. It's very serious. But they are hopefully getting their hands around that now. But even more broadly than that, Airbus has issues as well. Some of the engine makers are having issues just getting planes delivered on time. So you have a situation of rather strong demand, very constricted supply, but the airline profits are down from 2019. I mean, if you look at 2023 versus 2019, every single U.S. airline, their margins are down, with one very minor exception, a small airline called Sun Country. They're up, but let's keep them. Yeah, we can talk about them if you want, but they're very much an outlier. So I said demand good, supply constrained, profits down. So what gives? So the very, very biggest challenge that the U.S. airlines face right now is very serious cost inflation, particularly on the labor side. Not just on the labor side, but particularly on the labor side. And I'll give you just a very quick number here. So Southwest Airlines, since 2019, they've grown their capacity by about 12%, which is not a lot for 5 years worth of time. So 12% growth, but their labor costs have increased 49%. And Delta, a very similar situation, they've increased their capacity just 5%, but their labor costs are up 44%. So you can see the big challenge here. Now, if you're Delta, if you're United, to a lesser extent American, because they're more domestic heavy, but if you're United and Delta and you have those overseas routes, a lot of those premium seats, these giant loyalty programs, you're in better position to recoup those higher labor costs with higher fares, or let's call it higher yields, fares on average. So that those guys have tended to they're doing much better than, let's say, the domestic oriented low cost carriers, your Southwests, your Spirits of the world, your Frontier Airlines, JetBlue. Those airlines are struggling. Some of them even losing money. Some of them even, losing quite a lot of money. Largely, I'd say, not only there are other reasons, and you have to look at each year, airline by airline, but the labor cost inflation is a very, very big issue, and it's very U.S. specific. You won't see it elsewhere in the world as much.
Very interesting. I'm just looking at the number of employees in the U.S. in air transportation. It's interesting. It peaked at 2001, around 630,000 people. And then it declined rapidly to June 2022, but now it's to less than 400,000. But now there's 570,000 people working in the air transportation field. So I imagine that's pilots, flight attendants, everyone involved in that process. Why have labor costs gone up so much? How much of it is macroeconomic? All wages have gone up in the US, in which case that's very important to people listening for the macro, people interested in the macro economy. How much of it is specific to the airline industry?
Yeah, well, I think it is very specific. Now, as you mentioned, labor cost inflation has been an issue across the economy, although that's somewhat quelled a bit. Now, you have to remember with airlines, these are very heavily unionized companies. So the pilots are in terms of just total cost, pilots are your most important cost center, let's call it. All of the major pilot contracts just came up for renegotiation over the past 2-3 years. And it was a market where a lot of pilots retired early, or during COVID. In some cases, companies, they didn't know if they would ever need these pilots again. They were, because there was basically 2 years of dormancy. There was not much going on because of COVID. So a lot of senior pilots were basically took early retirement packages. So there's just a lot of constraints on pilot supply. And then suddenly in 2022, about the spring of 2022, was when demand in the US really started surging back rather quickly. And there were a couple of false starts. I don't know if you remember, like the Delta virus or Delta variant of the COVID virus. Everybody, thought that, oh yeah, things are going to get back to normal. And then the Delta thing came, and then the Omicron variant, and whenever that was late 2022 or 20, can't remember. But there was all these false starts. Finally, spring of 2022, when things just kind of took off, particularly on the domestic side. And there was this sudden, you can see the confluence of events where you had pilot shortages, but at the same time, you suddenly, the airlines suddenly needed all these pilots. So they had, and it had been a long time since they had last gotten raises in many cases. So they were in a very strong bargaining position. And so they got very, very healthy contracts. I mean, it's their, from the airline point of view, they're rather expensive. And so there's still, flight attendants too, or some of the flight attendant contracts are open right now as we speak. Mechanics. So yeah, a lot of, I would say the labor cost inflation in the airline business definitely exceeded that of the economy as a whole.
The labor cost inflation in the airlines, as well as the pricing of just airfare, exploded in 2022, up as much September 2022, up 42%. But there's been deflation for close to a year, over a year in terms of just the actual overall index. If demand is so strong, supply is constrained, and the airlines' costs are going up, okay, we get it. They squeezed everyone in 2022, but why have they lowered their costs somewhat over the past year?
If you compare average prices, and you have to be really careful with average fares because, are we talking about all the ancillary, Spirit Airlines, 50% of their revenue comes from ancillary charges, where the bag fees and food fee, all this kind of fees and things like that. So you have to be careful. Now, a very good, kind of a good indication to look at, rather than, I kind of, with all due respect to the Department of Labor and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, the airlines will tell you have to be careful with those. It's a very difficult sample to try to because of these ancillary fees. There's first class, there's business class, there's basic economy. But a very, a better way to do it is just look at an airline's yields. We call it yields. So it's basically recording on average what people are paying for flying one seat, 1 mile. Or yield is one passenger, 1 mile. We have another thing called RASM, revenue per available seat mile, which is the total revenue you're getting for one seat per mile. Okay, so there's passenger per mile, seat per mile. Don't worry about all that. Just say, in general, that's a good proxy for, what the fare levels are. Fares are way up from where they were in 2019. There's no two ways about that. Now, they have dipped down a little bit from 2023 to 2024. That is true on average. Some of that has to do with, again, you have to go airline by airline. Some of that has to do that there were a few fare wars going on in Orlando, for example, Florida, and more broadly, Las Vegas. A bunch of, low-cost carriers just threw a whole bunch of seats into those markets at the same time. And yes, their labor costs were way up, but they had no choice but to lower their fares. And what do we see? We see these carriers losing money. So you do have, it's not the railroads anymore. This is the airlines. It's like hyper competitive. They'll go into markets, they'll have fare wars. So that's one reason why you'll see some downward pressure. The other thing, and I think I may have mentioned this last time when we talked, anytime you're talking about airfares, you also have to consider the price of fuel. So fuel can be 40%, sometimes even 50% of an entire, the entire cost base of an airline. So, 2015, for example, late 2014 into 2015, global oil prices crashed. And fuel prices, that was party time for the global airline industry. And fares, sure enough, they dropped because airline costs dropped dramatically, and they could, they can go in, they can afford to go in and cut their fares and still make money. So what we've seen in 2022, you mentioned how fares, whoever, whether it's BLS or whatever you look at, fares actually did rise in 2022. That's true. But remember what happened in 2022, we had Russia invasion of Ukraine, oil prices spike. So, airlines will react to that by raising prices. Now, since then, fuel prices have come down. That's been kind of the saving grace for the U.S. airlines in 2023 anyway, was the fact that fuel prices did moderate a lot, and they've held steady. So year over year, they're still roughly, I think there hasn't been too much movement. So when people ask me, is fuel expensive right now? Is it for airlines? I would say it's manageable. It's not cheap. It's not as cheap as it was in 2019, but it's manageable. So, I like everything kind of reset upwards. The airlines, their cost base went way up from 2019, but their fares went way up from 2019 as well. So that's kind of where we are. Yeah. And Don't forget too, I guess the last thing I should add is that because of these supply shortages, that's putting upward pressure on wages. On fares also. So if, we didn't have these, Boeing and Airbus supply chain issues, we'd have more capacity in the US market. These airlines are itching to grow. But in a way, it's kind of a blessing in disguise for them. I always call it that because the fact that, supply is sort of artificially constrained, it has sort of kept a lid on discounting. And that's been helpful globally.
So it sounds like what I'm looking at for the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the consumer price index for airline fares, it may not give the entire picture because a lot of the pricing comes from ancillary fees, as you said. So you've got to look at revenue per available seat mile. Mm-hmm. And that is down, but not nearly as much as the chart that I'm looking at from the BLS would suggest. So it sounds like things are overall quite healthy. Would you say that the era of COVID-induced recession in airlines, and it was, depression in 2020, there's, no other words about it, worse history, that is very well over. And in terms of overall, how many people are on a plane every day for the US, that is at all-time highs, right?
So 2020, 2021 were lost years. Those were, greatest crisis the airline industry has ever faced, whether that's US or global, doesn't matter. Now, in terms of volume, yes, in the US, we are now all-time record volumes. The Transportation Security Administration, TSA, they publish numbers on this stuff. You can look exactly how many people fly, and they're very timely about those numbers. I think they just reported their July 4th holiday numbers, and they all, just record high. So the volumes are way up there. And that speaks to the health of the US economy, I think, to a large degree too. We know that the job market is still pretty strong. We know that stock prices are up. We know that, housing prices are still high. We know that people are earning, income on their, savings accounts now. So, and we have this just large, retiree population that's, with large, that own stocks, that own houses, that feel wealthy enough to travel. So it kind of makes sense that the volumes would be there. Now, as I mentioned, though, profits, the profit margin of the US airline industry today is still down from where it was in 2019. And that has to do, I think it would be more helpful to go airline by airline, which you probably don't have time for. But as I mentioned, some of these domestic carriers are like Southwest and like Spirit and like JetBlue are having a problem. I hesitate to, overgeneralize, but certainly these carriers, for one, they depend on domestic. And with the dollar being very strong, a lot of Americans are opting to go to Europe. Let's go to Portugal and hang out in Lisbon this summer instead of, last year we did Los Angeles. So there's a lot of that. So I think the domestic oriented carriers are suffering from that. At the same time, these aircraft delivery delays, I think, are really, really hurting the low cost carriers, especially because they depend heavily on growth. So sort of a cardinal rule of airline economics is that as you grow, you gain economies of scale. And the way I like to, sort of the example I use is if you, rent a gate at an airport, if you fly 7 times a day from that gate or 10 flights a day from that gate, you're still going to pay the same lease cost or whatever it is. So you get the economies of scale by growing. Same thing with, you're spreading fixed labor costs over more units, whatever. So that's very, very, when you look at a company like Spirit, very, very low cost carrier, it's not that they pay their pilots like peanuts or anything like that. That's not how they get their low cost. They do it through just these efficiencies of growth. But what happens when, Airbus and Boeing are not delivering your planes? You can't grow as much. So that's been a real constraint. There's a very specific problem with these one type of engines that are built by Pratt and Whitney, U.S. engine maker. It's owned by, I think RTX is the company. There's been a lot of consolidation in that space.
Which formerly Raytheon, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So those particular engines, they power one of the most popular aircraft right now called the A321neo. Those engines, they found some, potential manufacturing flaw or engineering flaw that's over my head, but they had to basically all those engines have to go back to the shop, and it's taking like more than a year to get through them all because, or to get through each and every one, because there's so many of these out there, and there's only so many, there's only so much maintenance capacity that exists around the world. So, but yeah, long story short, that's a big reason why some of these low cost carriers are really having a hard time. I gave you a couple of reasons. There are others, fare wars, we can go on, but there's a bit of a dichotomy going on. Delta and United are kind of, doing rather well. The low cost carriers, not so well. In fact, an activist investor is now attacking Southwest because they're not doing so well. And we can talk about that a little bit. And then American Airlines, which is the third of the big three. So when I say the big three U.S. airlines, Delta, United, American, those are the guys who are going, all over the world. American is least exposed international. They're also the one that are, as you might expect from that, performing or posting the lowest margins. Now their problems are a little go beyond that, but we'll leave it at that. Leave it there.
Hello, everyone. Permissionless 3 is coming to Salt Lake City on October 9th. The event for crypto natives is heading west, and we are bringing the biggest names in crypto together for an insane, can't-miss event. Hear from more than 200 industry titans, including Balaji, Mike Novogratz, and Dan Tapiero. The conversations at Permissionless will be covering the hottest themes in crypto, including modularity, restaking, the Bitcoin and Solana ecosystems, AI and crypto, rollups and L2s, institutional adoption, and of course, the November election that will be right around the corner. We couldn't be more excited about this event. Get your ticket today, and make sure I get some bragging rights by using my code FG10 to get 10% off. That's FG10, stands for Forward Guidance. I want to see you there. Do it. It's going to be at one of the most beautiful places in the United States, and everyone's going to be there. Van Spencer's going to be there. Jim Bianco's going to be there. Jan VanEck's going to be there. So what are you waiting for? Get your tickets now by clicking the link in the description and use code FG10. Back to the episode. Right. So a lot of US companies are hurt by a strong dollar. You think of, for example, Netflix, most of their costs, they produce it in Hollywood, they pay people in dollars, and they sell the content to Americans, but also to everyone around the world. So if you're a Japanese consumer and you're paying in yen, the strong dollar really, really hurts you. So you're less inclined to purchase that. Interestingly, though, so you said that a lot of American, not a lot, but the big three, or really the big two, Delta and United, they have a lot of international business, people flying to Japan, people flying to Europe, Americans, and they're more inclined to do that because the dollar is a strong currency, so they're getting more for bang for their buck, and so that's really benefiting them. However, domestic only or mostly domestic carriers such as Southwest or American, even though American does do international, they are hurting somewhat from that.
Yeah, I would say the domestic-oriented carriers don't really have too much of a dog in that fight. I mean, they don't have too much foreign exchange exposure. Now, the U.S. airlines, as you correctly said, the big guys, the United, Delta, to a lesser extent American, they're very much benefiting from the strong U.S. dollar because it empowers, Americans to go abroad. So, if you go to Japan right now, everything is cheap if you're an American, even Europe. Australia is another place that huge volumes of Americans are going. It's amazing. One time people viewing this, take a look at how many flights, nonstop flights exist now between the United States and New Zealand and Australia. It's quite remarkable. Now, the exception to that among US airlines is Hawaiian Airlines. It's a little bit of a niche discussion here, but it's interesting enough to mention. So Hawaiian Airlines, a big part of their business is bringing Japanese tourists to Hawaii. And that business is suffering because of the yen is so weak. It's so expensive now for Japanese travelers to go to Hawaii. It's the yen. It's also the fact that I think Hawaii is just, the hotels there have become really expensive. My colleagues at Skift, who we have some people who cover, hotels and tourism, and they all tell me that it's a very pricey place to be. So, they're an exception. Interestingly enough, so Hawaiian Airlines, because they're having so many issues with this, their stock price went down so much that Alaska Airlines last year came in and purchased them. They got them on the cheap. So that merger is still pending regulatory review. It's question mark whether or not will happen. I kind of think it will, but there's that. One more statement about foreign exchange, since we're talking about that. Outside of the U.S., the strong dollar is usually a very bad thing. And if you're in, let's say, Europe or Asia or whatever, what it means is that, so most of your costs are going to be in dollars, your fuel, your aircraft, your, just a lot of equipment. So that when the dollar's strong, that's really bad. And that's why you'll see a lot more, I guess this is true. I was going to say you're going to see a lot more airlines hedge their fuel abroad than you will in the U.S. It exists in the U.S. too, but less.
Very interesting. And then Alaska, which I know from you, is headquartered in Oregon.
Seattle.
Seattle. Yeah, thank you for that. And does Alaska do a lot of business of sending people to and from Russia? Were they hurt by that? No. Okay.
So many years ago, like right after the Cold War ended, I think they experimented with a couple of, but no, nothing Russia. So they are Alaska is a very, very successful airline. They are based in Seattle, as you mentioned. Alaska, the state of Alaska, is an important market for them. There's not a lot of good roads in Alaska, so you can imagine, people have to travel from one small city to another. So that's a nice little business for them. But what really has, really driven their success over the past 20 years or so has been the incredible growth of Seattle's economy. And you just think of the companies that are based there, Amazon and Microsoft, and you can go on and on. It's just been population growth, economic growth. They've been in the right place, the right time. They're also a very well-run company. The customers really like them. They have a good loyalty program, et cetera. So I don't want to, say that it's just coincidence, but certainly Seattle's helped them a lot. The problem, back in 2016, I want to say, they purchased another airline called Virgin America because they were realizing it's a little bit dangerous to be too Seattle-centric. So they purchased Virgin America, which was big in California. They had a lot of, cross-country routes, New York to LA, that kind of stuff, San Francisco to LA. They've had issues integrating that, and it was, we'll call it a semi-success. But they're running into that same growth problem again, where Seattle, there's only so much juice to squeeze out of that orange. The airport is becoming very congested also. So they're looking for more growth opportunities, hence the Hawaiian transaction. And it's a rather bold move because for the first time, they're actually going to be flying these large twin aisle jets. So when we talk about aircraft, we divide it into two types. So narrow bodies, which are the single aisles, A320 family, B737, like the MAX, which is the one that Boeing's had problems with. That's the single aisle. And then we have the wide bodies, the ones that tend to go international. So for the first time, Alaska is going to have these big, giant planes that they're going to be flying to, Japan, and they're going to be flying. We'll see. Maybe they do Europe. I don't know, but that's will be a challenge for them. But it's a good company, so well run.
And then tell us about how airlines are hedging their fuel costs. As fuel costs go up, their costs go up, so it's really bad for them. But they can hedge some of that risk out. But then if the cost of fuel doesn't go up, you wish you didn't hedge. So it's a double-edged sword. How many of the airlines hedge? How much do they hedge, and how successful are they at it?
So Southwest is probably the only airline left in the U.S. that hedges a very substantial portion of the fuel. I might be wrong. There may be some others, but certainly like American has moved away from that. I don't believe United does any hedging anymore, maybe a little bit here and there, but it's expensive. I mean, it's buying insurance, and the premiums are very high. And airlines in the past have been burned by it. I mean, I remember Delta right before the big recession in 2008, 2009. They had a lot of their fuel hedged, and then suddenly the price collapsed, and they were paying really high fuel fares, high fuel costs, and so it can be dangerous. I think airlines ultimately have concluded that the best way to manage the risk of fuel going up is through fares and through capacity cuts. So if fares go up 20%, we're going to start cutting capacity. We're going to do our best to lift fares and handle it that way. This way we can avoid, all the risk of a sudden, first of all the, the expensive premiums, but then also the risk of, fuel prices just collapsing overnight. And then we're uncompetitive with our rivals that didn't hedge. Now, Southwest has, they have quite an amazing record. And if you, I did, if I may say, I did write a history book about Delta Airlines, and one of
it's the one behind you, Glory, Lost and Found.
Yes, if I may, I've got my 2 books back here, American Places and Glory, Lost and Found, is about Delta. And very prominent in that story during the 2000s, Southwest basically avoided the very dismal fate of the rest of the industry by very actively hedging their fuel. I would say luckily hedging their fuel. So they were kind of, when fuel started spiking after 9/11, after the Iraq War of 2003, whatever it was, Southwest was protected. And they were, that basically changed the course. They were able to attack different hubs and grow, and the other guy. So Southwest is in a very enviable position, but that was, 20 years ago. So, but they are still hedging. They are still active hedgers.
They are still hedging, and I imagine Southwest benefited from hedging as jet fuel prices rose because they probably bought jet fuel futures or did some contract with the bank.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then you said Delta started to hedge just at the great financial crisis, but then prices collapsed, so they had to pay a lot higher price. Another way of saying that, because you're locking in a higher price, and that if the price falls, is that they paid the spot price of collapsed flight, but then they had a locked in huge mark-to-market loss that they owed to a bank.
Exactly. You're getting it. And their balance sheet was like completely, it almost caused them to go bankrupt again. Like, I mean, it was just, I don't think it was Delta in this case, but their Air Canada, this just popped into my head. They almost had to go bankrupt because of their mark-to-market, their balance sheet was just all scarred by these, really, and I don't understand all the details about that, but it can be very dangerous if you, get involved in these contracts. So now I should say, we're talking about this conversation has been very U.S. centric. I do, cover airlines around the world. The airlines outside of the U.S. typically more active hedgers. They also don't only hedge their fuel, but they'll also hedge their exchange rate exposure as well. Typically, sometimes their interest rate risk, but yeah, but fuel's the big one.
Delta, I don't know how much they hedge in the trading, but they do own a oil refinery which produces jet fuel. How big is that relative to their jet fuel that they actually used, or is that just kind of a nice thing, but not, it's peanuts? It's not that big.
Yeah, it's kind of, I'd say lean more towards peanuts. It's not that big of an overall picture. It's so back in whenever it was in the 2010s, sometime mid 2010s, I think it was. There was a real concern that about the supply of jet fuel in the Northeast of the United States. There was this big Philadelphia refinery that I believe it was going to close, or I don't know if it had to go through some heavy maintenance or something. So Delta purchased it. And some of this is conjecture. I don't know exactly what the motivation was, but I think they purchased it more as an insurance to, let's keep the supply, let's hedge our bets here out of concern that we might have an issue with supply in the Northeast, very important region for us. They've had years where the refinery loses money. They've had years where the refinery makes a little bit of money. I've never seen it have any material impact on their overall margins or anything like that. I mean, I can, just look real quickly. So Delta, like in 2023, they paid $2.83 per gallon on average for fuel, whereas United paid $3 and a penny, 301. So you can see, and that actually kind of a big difference there, but that not all of that is a refinery, but some of it is. So I think they get a little bit of a benefit there. Now, airlines will pay different average fuel prices based on also where they fuel up. West Coast tends to be more expensive than the East Coast, things like that. So, if you go international, there's some places where the taxes are very high. So could be, but I think Delta is right now, they're probably getting a little bit of benefit from the refinery, but it's not, I think it's a very big topic in the media. Like, wow, an airline buys this is a huge business model, change, but it's more much ado about nothing, I think.
Got it. And then what do the airlines' balance sheets look like? I know COVID was just so bad for them. Traffic went to nearly zero. Delta, American, they issued a ton of debt, some of which was bought by the government, the government loaned them money at very, very favorable rates. So there definitely was a bailout. Perhaps some companies, would have gone bankrupt if it weren't for that. And then the capital markets were very open in 2020, so they issued a ton of debt. How have they been managing those large debt loads? Have they been attempting to pay them down? And how have they been impacted by the dramatic rise in interest rates? Which, of course, if you locked in low long-term rates, you're not, impacted by it as much.
The government bailout during COVID was basically, it was either that or pretty much every airline would have went bankrupt. I mean, there was no revenues for a period, or insignificant amount of revenues. So,
and Jay, sorry, we see term bailout, like in 2008, the bailout of the banks. It was the Federal Reserve lending. It was the government making loans, the fiscal government, as well as the government injecting equity capital. I know for the airlines that they injected a bunch of debt capital, loaning money. Did they also inject equity capital, or was it just those loans?
I believe there were some warrants issued. So I think there was some equity claim. At this point, I don't think that the government holds any equity position in any airline. If they did, it's not a big one. So yeah, don't think of what happened with Citigroup, where the government literally took a chunk of the, or AIG or whatever it was. It's not like that at all. These are still, private sector companies. The government, the big thing to know about the governments, and I apologize for not knowing some of the details, but the big thing to know is that the reason why the government felt very compelled to step in is because the airlines were in a situation where they would have had to lay off just basically everybody. I mean, they just had no revenue coming in. So it was almost like a jobs protection program. Mm-hmm. But if that has any bad connotation, it shouldn't, because in a good way. I mean, can you imagine if suddenly every pilot was out of a job, and then 6 months later, 1 year later, 2 years later, demand suddenly comes back, and you can't just take a pilot off the street and say, "Oh, get back in the cockpit." You got to recertify them. You've got to they have this very strict training standards. So you wanted to keep the aviation ecosystem, the aviation labor supply fresh and active, and it was sort of an emergency situation. They kind of had to step in to keep these things. So that was the situation with that. Now, yeah, absolutely. I mean, airlines are still, they also very heavily borrowed in private markets, and a lot of them, luckily, they, had credit lines that were open to them that were left over from pre-COVID, and they tapped, pretty much everything that they had from those lines. So they are still very much, paying those back today. An airline like American has their balance sheet. There's a lot of debt. I mean, it's not pretty. Whereas Southwest is still an investment grade credit. So it can vary a lot. I believe Delta was investment grade, and I don't think they're back yet, but they're kind of moving. So they're actively paying down debt. I mean, they are making money, the Deltas of the world anyway. Even Southwest made money last year. Be clear about that. Not as much as, they're accustomed to making, but they did make money last year. So they have been, servicing their debts. Now, the other important thing to remember when we're talking about financing an airline is that the assets that, it's a very asset heavy industry. So these aircraft are so valuable right now, particularly because of the supply shortage, that this is very valuable collateral. So you can go into, you can go to a leasing company and say, "Hey, we'll sell you this plane and lease it back to us. So it won't affect our operations, but they'll give you a ton of cash for it." That's been very popular around the world right now, these sale leaseback transactions. And the same thing with, there are different investment companies or whatever that will do this kind of thing. Now, they also, in addition to the aircraft, some of the bigger airlines also have these frequent flyer programs, these loyalty programs. And airlines have been using those as collateral as well. They've been very careful because they don't want to sell them. They're very strategically important. Just think of all the data that they have on customers. And so they've had to be very careful about structuring them in the way that, they'll never lose control over it. But you do see more of that now. There's a famous case of Air Canada. They sold their loyalty program 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and they just regretted it ever since. And then maybe 2018, I can't remember exactly, late 2010s, they bought it back, but it took a lot of effort. They had to pay a lot of money. So these, you want to keep them in-house. You want to be careful about never losing control of them. But you do see more of that now. So aircraft financing, it hasn't been like, I can't say that higher interest rates, of course, it's especially when we're talking globally, it has been a cost challenge for the industry. But I think in the U.S., it's not the real estate business where, or a business that's really heavily interest rate exposed. Let's put it that way.
That makes sense. I'm just looking at a chart of Delta's total long-term debt. Pre-2020, it was about $10 billion. It spiked to $34 billion by late 2020. And now it's $19 billion, so less than $20 billion. They've been paying down $16 billion worth of debt. So they have been paying down their debt, and their interest expense has been going down too, which suggests to me, as you implied, they have more fixed rate, longer duration liability. So they locked in their long-term thing. It's not like they have a 90-day bank loan that their interest expense fluctuates a ton with rising or falling interest rates. What about share buybacks? Are these companies poised to do buybacks now, or they still need to pay down more debt?
Well, that was very controversial. And, there's some people who argued that, I think this is a little bit of a stretch, but they said that, the reason why airlines were so unprepared for COVID is because they used all their cash to buy back stock. I think if they did zero buybacks, the COVID crisis would have wiped them out of cash, no matter, regardless of that. Now, it is still, it's obviously still something that they would like to do. There were some, I believe, provisions in the government assistance programs that prevented airlines, that basically banned them from doing stock buybacks. But there were conditions, may have been for a certain number of years, maybe until they pay back or whatever. So they may be getting into the position where they, are able to do that coming up. As you alluded to, though, I think probably the biggest priority for free cash flow right now is paying down all that debt, which, we'll see. As you mentioned, we're talking on Wednesday, July 10th. Tomorrow is the day when Delta is going to report their earnings. They kind of kick off the earnings season for second quarter. And I suspect they're going to say what they always say, a very, very high priority for our cash is, get that debt down, get the investment grade credit rating back, and, take it from there. Maybe down the road, we could do some stock buybacks. But I think that's where we're at right now in 2024.
Thank you. And then just on the topic of coach, business class, first class, I imagine that a lot of the profitability comes from that business class and especially first class market share. How are those types of premium seats, premium revenue for available seat mile going? And because I know there was a time, let's say 2021, when people would say, okay, the flights will come back, but everything is conducted over Zoom. So the time that you fly business class down to Georgia to shake someone's hand, those days are over. Has that narrative, kind of been proven false?
Maybe not false. I mean, there definitely patterns have changed since COVID, and people are Zooming more for sure. But we have seen very recently, I'd say just in the past, during first quarter earnings season, airlines started saying that some of the big corporate business has come back. So if the smaller business travel, small and medium enterprises, that stuff has been pretty strong throughout, starting in 2022, coming out of COVID, maybe 23. The stuff that was really depressed were just the big, the very large companies that spend, hundreds of millions of dollars on travel. The Microsoft, it was actually, they would say, especially the West Coast tech companies. And maybe because they were, they're on the forefront of this video conferencing technology. But no, that stuff is coming back now. So that's been kind of an added tailwind for the airlines that, provide that service. Now, obviously, if you're Southwest doesn't have a premium class. So they get a lot of business traffic, but it tends to be small, medium. But if you're Alaska Airlines in Seattle, Microsoft is one of your biggest customers. Amazon is one. So this is a big tailwind. If you're United, if you're Delta. So that's been helpful. Now, premium in general has been very, very strong, as I mentioned earlier, but a lot of that has been just premium leisure, people paying out of their pocket. I just retired. I'm going, we're taking the family to Europe, and let's do it right. Let's sit in first class. There's a lot of that, a ton of that. So that has been interesting. That Southwest has always, very I don't want to say hard-headed because that's not, but they've been very wedded to this idea, like, let's keep it simple. We have one class of service. We don't, nothing fancy.
There's no first class or business class in Southwest at all.
Nope.
Interesting.
Yep, nothing. It's all same. So, they've kind of on the edges, they've said, okay, well, you can pay a little extra. We'll board you first. We'll give you like a privileged boarding thing, whatever. So there's a little bit, but for the most part, they haven't been able to participate in this upsurge of premium demand. And that is one reason why Elliott Management, this activist investor, a couple of weeks ago, or whenever it was, a month ago, they're now trying to get rid of Southwest. I talked about how Ancora was trying to get rid of Norfolk Southern's management in the railroad industry. Same thing is happening at Southwest in the airline industry. They're saying, look, you keep missing your revenue guidance. Your earnings are down. You're not, Southwest had this very giant operational blow up in, I think, the winter of 2022. I think it was 22, where they just lost huge amount of money. It's probably the most expensive operational mishap in the history of the U.S. airline industry. I mean, excess of $1 billion lost. So this company is saying, look, it's time for a change. And one giant question hanging over Southwest is, will they kind of break with the pattern and offer some sort of premium seats? Maybe it's a premium economy, or I don't know. They're going to be holding a big investor day event in September. So all eyes are on that. And of course, what happens at that event may ultimately, or likely ultimately, influence the outcome of, whether this activist investor is successful or not.
Elliott Management, of course, a very well-established, successful, and large activist investor, notable for suing Argentina to get paid on their bonds. Jay, the Elliott Management's critique of, oh, hey, Southwest, not only did you have this hugely expensive operational mishap or disaster in a few years back, but also your margins are much lower than United. They're much lower than American, Delta. Do you think that is a fair critique or not, and why?
I don't think it's fair, and I'm going to tell you why. Elliott, if you look through their, they put a big, nice little presentation together, and this is why, very detailed reasons of why we think it's time for a management change. Very central to their premise is, or their thesis, it's very much built upon comparing Southwest to United, Delta, and American, and I think that's unfair. Particularly because they don't have the premium, they don't have the international stuff. So okay, maybe you can argue Southwest Management should have had a premium class. Okay, fair criticism. No one argues that they should be flying to Argentina or France or Japan. They don't have that section of the market that's been really booming. I mean, in all fairness, Southwest in last year, they outperformed JetBlue, they outperformed Spirit, they outperformed Frontier Airlines. So they're actually doing better than, it's hard to even say that there's a peer set because Southwest is so unique.
Yeah, I mean, it was founded by a lawyer who just started chartering planes from one part of Texas to the other part, right? Like, it's a very direct business model. It's go here, no frills. We're not going to take you to Sao Paulo. Just get in the plane and get out. Yep,
that's a great history, by the way. So history of Southwest Airlines. Herb Kelleher, very famous American entrepreneur. But exactly, yeah. I mean, it's a very unique business model, even from the other low-cost carriers. They're the largest domestic. Southwest is the largest domestic airline in the U.S. They're absolutely giant. They dominate many small business markets. So if you think about, Kansas City to Amarillo, Texas, or Kansas City to Phoenix. I mean, if you've got to go between those two cities, and there's hundreds of them, Southwest is often going to be, they're going to offer the most frequencies, the most optionality. 2 free bags is part of their, it's very controversial. Should they charge for bags? It's just a very unique, and the way they schedule, it's hard to get into this in detail, but the way they schedule their aircraft are very, very different. They don't use the same sort of hub and spoke type route networks that the other guys use. So everything is very unique. And that, incidentally, makes it difficult for them to buy off-the-shelf software. So there are a couple, you can imagine just developing software in-house is very, very difficult. And they've tried that in the past for certain functions. So what airlines typically do is they go to, there's a handful of like really big software companies that provide, aircraft scheduling software, route planning software, operational software, airport gate management, all that. Sabre is one big one in Dallas, Amadeus, they're based in Spain. So, they wound up, Southwest a couple of years ago, they wound up investing a lot of money in Amadeus, the Spanish company. They bought their software, and it's they get criticized. Southwest gets criticized a lot, lagging behind in their technology, and I think that's a little bit unfair because they did invest in this new system, but it's harder to apply this off-the-shelf system to Southwest. I mean, everything is just a little more difficult. So I always keep that in the back of my mind when you see the criticism from, companies like Elliott. So I don't want to dismiss Elliott entirely. I mean, it is true that, there are areas of Southwest that certainly I personally would, have questions about, why are they're losing a ton of money in Hawaii, for example, like flying intra-Hawaiian routes, just a very small example of, maybe they do need new thinking on that. I don't know, but I'm giving you a very long answer here, but in general, I think the Elliott argument maybe needs to be a little bit firmer to convince investors, but we'll see.
We will see. Very, very interesting take. You mentioned the sale leaseback model of selling your airplanes and then leasing them back. I think one company involved on the other side of that transaction is AerCap. The ticker is AER. It used to be part of GE. What's going on there? Because that could be a little bit of a dodgy way, maybe to show profit, is just to sell your aircraft and then lease it back. Yeah, just tell us more about that.
Yeah, so AerCap, to clarify, is the largest aircraft leasing company in the world. They were never part of GE, but they actually bought GE's leasing company. So they bought, just to cut. So they bought GECAS was and they purchased that. So they're huge, they're giant. And yeah, so airlines are in fact playing this game where they'll book a bunch of profits from their sale leaseback deals, and they'll include that in their operating results. The analysts go after them all the time. Every earnings quarter, there's an argument between Frontier Airlines and the JP Morgan analysts, whoever. I don't have an opinion either way. I'm not an accountant. Is that fair? Is it unfair? Other than to say, I make sure we at Skift every quarter we run sort of our profit rankings. The most profitable airlines in the world. We run a table, and I'm always careful to, if there's an airline that's clearly goosing their numbers with sale leaseback deals.
And who would be an example of some of the biggest goosers?
Frontier Airlines. Gol in Brazil is another one. Okay. They're in bankruptcy now, but they've done a lot. Wizz Air in Europe, that's a European airline. There's probably not fair to just single out, but those are a couple of Indigo Airlines in India. So some of these are very strong. Indigo's a extremely well-run airline. In fact, the founder was just appointed to the Southwest board just this week. So there's some connection there. Indigo, very well-run airline in India, very profitable. They absolutely dominate the domestic Indian landscape now. But they goose the numbers. They goose the profit figures. I use that term kiddingly. Accountants obviously are okay with it, but
accountants have been okay with many things in the past that have doctored economic reality. So just because accountants doesn't mean it.
Good point, Jack.
What do you make of? I think General Electric recently spun out or split up its company into GE Aviation. It's its own company now. What do they do, and what do you think about it?
Sure. So those guys make the engines. Okay. So they are one of a couple of big engine suppliers. Rolls-Royce is another. Rolls-Royce is only doing the wide bodies, the real big ones. And then the other real big one is Pratt & Whitney, which we talked about. They're, owned by what was Raytheon. They're very successful engine maker. This MAX plane that you hear about in the news a lot, that Boeing made. I want to say this about the MAX. Despite, it obviously had those two awful crashes. As a commercially speaking, I mean, the Max is still a very, very successful plane. Airlines are buying them in the hundreds. They're, still selling like hotcakes. It's a very, very economic aircraft. And those are powered by CFM engines, which is a consortium that involves GE engines. So there's an example. GE also builds engines for, this Dreamliner plane that's very popular. So yeah, that's GE. Now, the one interesting question going forward is not about engine makers specifically, but about the airframe manufacturers. Will Boeing and Airbus ever get a competitor? Will there ever be a third competitor? There's, talk about China. Perhaps, they do have a company called Comac that's starting to build airplanes of similar size, but they're very, very far behind. And they are very, very dependent on Western technology, Honeywell, Aerodynamics, and you can go on. I believe the engines, even are built by GE or Pratt, or so that's a question, kind of a hot topic in the industry as well. Will Boeing and Airbus ever have a competitor? Otherwise, it's a duopoly, and airlines hate that.
Boeing has just been a disaster. So much tragedy, poorly built planes, but interesting, people are still buying them. How come Airbus isn't just making, hand over fist money? I mean, I'm sure there are, but just looking at the stock price and the profits, it could be a little bit better. How come Airbus isn't differentiating itself and saying, we have a duopoly and our competitor is, going through a lot of stuff, to put it mildly. So we basically have a monopoly and we're going to just kill it.
To a certain extent, they are winning business. There was an example recently, I believe, of a Korean Air order that might have went to Boeing, probably likely would have gone to Boeing, that instead went to Airbus. However, Airbus is having their own supply problems. So if you're an airline and Boeing tells you, well, I can't get a plane for the next 5 years, and Airbus says, well, we can't get the plane to you the next 5 years either. I mean, what are you going to do? It's there. You have to. Or, there are some cases where Boeing may be able to get a plane to you earlier, just there may be specific examples. So the airlines are dealing with very limited flexibility in switching back and forth. Also, too, it's not easy. If you have an all Boeing fleet, you can't just suddenly switch. You can, but it's costly to suddenly switch to Airbus. The pilots have to have a different tree. You have to have a whole different maintenance operation. You have to, so it's only going to go so far for Airbus in winning new business from what's happening at Boeing. So yeah, it's a duopoly. I mean, that's the bottom line. And Boeing is, like I said, I mean, their planes they're good planes. They're economic. They're I'm speaking obviously just economically here. The safety issues, I have no comment on that. I'm not an expert in any of that, but the 787s that they produce that, can take you from the United States to any point pretty much on the planet, those are really excellent, fuel efficient, airlines that people like. And so, and there's not many other options. Airbus has a competing product called the A350, but you're not going to really get it any sooner. And it has different, it's not exactly the same. It might be, depending on the model, it might be a little smaller, a little larger. So you've got to factor in all these things.
Would you say that this is a favorable environment for companies that are buying planes and then leasing them back, such as AerCap?
If you're just strictly buying airplanes, if you're an airline, and it's a very, very expensive market right now. If you're a leasing company, it is expensive to buy. Although, if you have a nice fleet of aircraft ready to be rented out, you're in a really nice position because the supply is so tight. So, you're probably getting calls, 10 times a day from different airlines, 100 times a day from different airlines. Like, hey, I need a 737 available for next summer. It's my peak season. I just been told that the engine's going to be in the shop for longer than expected. It's not, I need it by July because that's my peak season. Can you get me? So I think the leasing companies are sitting in a pretty good position right now.
What's the supply picture going to be like? I mean, when are Boeing and Airbus finally going to produce the planes that the people need, the airlines need?
Well, they'll tell you that it's going to be years. That it's, we're looking 2029, 2030 before all these supply chain problems get ironed out. So it's something that we're going to have to live with for a while. Airlines are going to have to live with for a while. As I said at the outset, It's a little bit of a blessing in disguise, though, because it's kept a lid on capacity, which has kept a floor on fares, you can say. And that's been helping. We didn't get a chance to talk too much about airlines abroad, but if you speak about, the industry at large globally, it's been 2024. It's been a very good year so far for the airline industry, profitable year. And I think part of it is because supply has been, suppressed. Of course, demand pretty strong as well. Yeah.
And painting with a broad brush here, as we approach a close, what's going on in the rest of the world? Let's start with Asia.
Sure. Yeah. So big. Well, we'll even narrow it down a little. Obviously, Asia can be anything from India to Singapore to China. So let's just in pieces. So in Northeast Asia, which is China, Japan, Korea, you have a couple things going on. So the Chinese market actually doing rather well domestically. It's very, very busy. All-time traffic highs domestically. Internationally has been, should I use the words disaster? I don't know if that. It's been very depressed, particularly the long haul stuff. So the U.S. to China nonstops between the two markets, barely exists anymore. There's just a handful of flights where that was, very much not the case in 2019. And the reason has to do with basically the Russia-Ukraine war. So the U.S. airlines are not allowed to fly over Russian airspace. The Chinese airlines can. So the U.S. guys, you can imagine, say that's an unfair advantage, and the two governments haven't been able to come to any kind of accord on normalizing the flight frequencies between those two markets. So, it's a little bit about China. Japan, you have two major airlines. Both are doing fairly well. Obviously, the cheap yen is, very instrumental in shaping some of the demand patterns that they're seeing and the cost patterns, the cost challenges. A lot of people coming into Japan now, whereas fewer people going out because of the yen. I'll skip over to, Southeast Asia. Singapore Airlines is a prominent airline that everyone would know. Singapore Airlines, traditionally has been a very, very profitable, successful carrier, kind of the gold standard for, good quality and service. They actually did, profit-wise, have a very difficult 2010s. They always made money, but just the margins are very low largely because of capacity, just, Gulf carriers and Chinese carriers and low-cost carriers and startup carriers, they were just kind of flooded, like their routes were just had too much capacity. That has all reversed post-COVID. Huge amount of capacity got weeded out during the COVID crisis. At the same time, these airlines cut their costs dramatically. Very different in the U.S., where you had like labor costs go up. In Asia, in many jurisdictions, labor costs have actually dropped. Sometimes, not in Singapore's case, but sometimes through bankruptcy proceedings. So you have a situation where Singapore Airlines is now doing better than ever. And that's true even from some of the carriers that traditionally lose money, like Thai Airways and Philippine Airlines and Malaysia Airlines. Those carriers are now performing extremely well. I don't know how long it will last, but let's just say their costs have been depressed, and they're operating in a very strong, kind of post-COVID bounce back revenue environment. India, there's really it's a battle between two big airlines now, Air India, which is reprivatized, and Indigo, which I mentioned before. Indigo is now, the traditionally just domestic, short-haul international. They're going big now. Earlier this year, they said they're going to buy these big wide-body aircraft. They're going to have a business class. They're going to have a big loyalty program. So they're turning into an intercontinental carrier, trying to, and again, I don't want to talk, you can go on forever about this stuff, but right now, a lot of India's intercontinental traffic travels through the Gulf on carriers like Emirates, Qatar Airways. Indigo wants that back. Air India wants it back too. They've traditionally stumbled because, government bureaucracy, all this kind of stuff, but they're now private. Indigo is now going intercontinental. So we'll see what they're doing. So yeah, that's the kind of things that we do, at Airline Weekly. We go around the world and we discuss, the major trends for all the different airlines in different markets. Yeah.
And so Delta reports tomorrow. What is your expectation of just broad sense of what the trends are going to be, what the talking points are going to be in the call, and how that might impact Delta?
Yeah, so we expect the Delta's always kind of, we talked about Singapore Airlines being the gold standard for Delta in some ways is that way in the US. They're kind of known for always, beating everybody else on margin, at least the big guys. They're, very, very strong customer service reputation. They've already guided to an operating margin of, I believe, 14 and 15%, which for an airline in the second quarter is very strong. I don't know off the top of my head what they did last year, but probably something similar. So what we're looking for now, for all these airlines as they start reporting, is are they seeing any cracks in this demand boom that I've been mentioning? Is anybody going to say, well, things are okay for the summer, but the bookings for the fall are starting to weaken? Are they going to say, well, the international, that whole party is over. Summer's going to be, we've got all these people booked in the summer, but yeah, once we get into the fall, everybody's starting to take the message trip. Things like that are what we're going to be looking for.
How would you say air fares and air volumes, TSA throughput, respond to economic weakness? There has not been a recession, despite it being much anticipated for over 2 years, maybe close to 3 years. And the airlines have done well. If we do, and obviously we will, but if in short order the U.S. economy does enter a recession, how do you think that will impact pricing and volume? Like, is it much more sensitive to the cyclical factors, or are there the structural tailwinds are more important, as well as maybe if fuel costs go down, that could help too?
Bingo, that was going to be my answer. So yeah, so demand is very sensitive to the macroeconomic situation. If there is a recession, you can pretty much count on demand going down. But if there's a recession and that corresponds with lower fuel prices, airlines are going to be okay with that, depending on the degree to which each has happened. Now, there obviously have been situations before where fuel prices go up and you have a recession. But usually one goes with the other. So tends to be like, good examples with the big, the giant economic recession in 2008, 2009, oil prices went down to like $30 a barrel at one point. Even during COVID, oil prices went down to zero at one point, but that was kind of a weird thing. But that usually happens, so airlines can sort of manage that. But of course, if oil prices stay high, and there could be different kinds of recessions too. I mean, remember that we have had the railroads will tell you we've had kind of a manufacturing recession the last couple of years, or at least, a manufacturing economy that's kind of bounced along the bottom. But the reason why the U.S. economy grew 3%, in the last half of 2023 is because things like travel were booming. The service side of the economy is booming. So we don't know, if that could switch back. Maybe people will stop traveling, and they'll start buying Pelotons again. I don't know. Could have a recession that specifically, disproportionately affects travel. We don't know. But that's the stuff that we're always looking out for.
Jay, thanks so much for coming on. Give us the quadruple plug. Where can people find, number one, Skift Airline Weekly, number two, your weekly Substack, Railroad Weekly, as well as your two books that you've written? Yeah,
thanks for that opportunity there. So Skift, you can just go to airlineweekly.com and see our newsletter, or skift.com. That's Skift, we like to think of ourselves as the Bloomberg of travel. We cover all aspects of the travel and tourism industry around the world. So Railroad Weekly, it's on Substack. It's just railroadweekly.substack.com. You can go check that out. And then, my two books behind me, American Places. That is a book I did for a while. I'd had a newsletter about the U.S. economy, and I took about 70 different places in the United States, tried to be as representative as possible. Big giant cities like Los Angeles, smaller towns like Lewiston, Maine, just 70 of them. And I described, very succinctly how their economies work. What are the big employers there? What's the labor market look like? What are the big issues that, local officials think about? If you're in Vermont, you're wondering where are you going to find labor? If you're, pretty much everywhere in the U.S., where the housing shortage is a big thing. So I discuss issues like these, city by city, and a little bit about the history of how they became big cities and things like that. And finally, the Delta book, Glory, Lost, and Found, which I co-wrote with Seth Kaplan, my old Airline Weekly colleague. That's about, the history of Delta Airlines. So if you're, if you're interested in the airline business, I'm sure you'll enjoy that.
Appreciate that. Jay, thanks again.
Thank you, Jack.
Thanks for watching. Remember to check out vaneck.com/MOATFG to learn more about the VanEck Morningstar Wide Moat ETF, ticker MOAT. Lastly, Forward Guidance is available not just on YouTube, but on all podcast apps, and a video version is available on Spotify and Twitter, where I post interviews regularly. Thanks again. Until next time.